I believe that every diagnosis, every disability, especially things like autism and ADHD and things like that, like it can really be a superpower. And that's why we have a superhero theme at Ability Innovations, because there's things that these kids are able to do that just regular run-of-the-mill people like us we can't even do it. We can't even fathom how to do that, but it just is so close to who they are.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Therapy Unmasked. This is probably going to be our best episode ever because it's just me and Nick today.
And we're just ad-libbing. Yeah.
We had a pretty cool guest that was kind of come on this morning, but she ended up falling ill. So this is Plan B, but I think Plan B is actually pretty cool because today we're going to be talking all about developmental milestones that your kids should be hitting on their own. So I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Nick and he'll just dive right into this.
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite parts of when I was in school too, of learning about the developmental milestones. And I hadn't had children yet. And so I didn't really have like a foundation, but it was extremely helpful when I was having my kids and they were growing up and being able to see like these developmental milestones and how they progress and where they're supposed to be at. There's something that I think most parents are like, they've heard about, they're cognizant about because you get it from your doctor, right? The doctor says, hey, is your kid doing this? And are they doing this? And by this age, I would expect them to be doing these kinds of things. And so we see some of that in the doctor's office and things like that. But as therapists, we're relying really heavily on these like developmental milestones, and especially here at Ability Innovations, because we're very developmental. Like the reason why we do play-based and everything is because it's part of the development of children and it's part of that developmental progression that they have. And so we're just going to dive in and talk a little bit about these milestones and why they're important and how we address them, and then maybe some tips and tricks for parents. This document that we have here is all about, it's an early childhood development chart. And we get this from a few of our assessments that we do. They have different versions of this, but it goes through like each part of their lifespan. So it'll go like birth to 3 months and what we're looking at in there, up from 3 to 6 months, and then 6 to 9 months and all of that. And we see a lot of these things like, is your kid able to hold their head up? Do they track your face when you're looking at them? When you present food to them, like even if it's like breastfeeding, when you present that to them, are they responding to it? Are they turning their head to it? Those kinds of things. So we look at all of those things, but some of the more, I think, interesting ones are ones when kids are toddlers and we really start to hone in on what they're doing as toddlers. And I think for the speech side, it's really interesting because the speech people are looking at like how many words is your kid saying? Mm-hmm. And what would you guess by age 2? How many words should a kid have? Yeah. They should have at least 20, but we're looking at like 500.
See, I'm not a parent, so I'm not.
Yeah. And so you don't really have
right.
You don't really have anything to tie that to, and the speech people can correct me because I might be a little off on the number, but a lot of times by age 2, like we're looking at like, they should have hundreds of words in their repertoire. Mm-hmm. And they may not be able to use all of those consistently, but they should be saying about 100 or 300 words or 500 words or something like that. And so if they've only got like around 20, then we're like, okay, we need to work on this. Mm-hmm. Like, and what is it that's holding them back from this word acquisition? And some other things are, we see a lot of kids in the clinic that they're coming in because they weren't crawling or they haven't been able to, like, we'll see infants that haven't been able to roll over from side to side. And the parents are like, I don't know what to do with this. Is this something I should be worried about? And we have something on the website, right? Of developmental charts.
We have converted this whole chart that Nick is holding here onto the website. And I can link that in the show notes so you can kind of follow along.
Yeah, and this kind of stuff, this is based in research. And this is the go-to for parents that are curious about like, when is this supposed to happen, and should I be worried about this? Because if a kid is not rolling over and you see other kids about their same age and they're just able to like roll over and scoot on their belly or something like that, and you're like, well, my kid still isn't even rolling over, should I be concerned? And the answer is yes. Because if there's holes or there's pauses in any of this developmental sequencing, then parents should be concerned, because usually normal development doesn't take pauses like that. Maybe small, brief ones, but if they're outside of that window where they're like, this is supposed to happen between these months, if they're outside of that window, then yeah, we really should get them into therapy and see what's going on, because there could be a myriad of things that are causing that.
I heard I think it was one of the therapists here, and they had said it's hard to really look at your own child objectively with these milestones. And that's why it's helpful to bring them in for like a consultation, for example, so that you can get an objective opinion from a licensed therapist on, are my kids actually in the spot they're supposed to be for their current growth and development. So I think like as a parent, it's important to recognize that you kind of look at your own child differently than you do other kids. So you might purposely or subconsciously be missing some of these issues that your children have. And so that's why it's important to still bring them in and see.
And I think that having people, like we used to do a thing back when I was in school, there was a program called Parent to Parent. And we would just talk about like these milestones, but in an informal setting with parents. They could just come in and ask and show us like what their kid is doing, and then we could give them advice. And I think that those kinds of programs are helpful because, I mean, as parents, we don't really know how to assess what our kids are doing or not doing. I mean, we look at like their nieces and nephews, or, you know, most of us have never had like a lot of exposure to kids. And, you know, as therapists, we're seeing like hundreds of kids all the time, like hundreds a week, and all different kinds of kids. And so we get a really good sense of these developmental milestones and where kids should be. But also we have this kind of data from research that really helps drive where normal development should be and how we get kids to that. Or even just like bridging gaps. Like they may not be able to do this, but for instance, like if a kid doesn't really learn how to crawl, maybe they're scooting across the floor, but then they have older siblings, for example, they're just running around. So they're like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. So they just get up and start walking and toddling, but they never got to that crawl stage, really. That's a gap, right? And we have to bridge that gap. We have to close that gap if we can. And the things that we do that are sequential, they teach our brains and our bodies certain things that we need for later on. For example, the crawling. If a kid is not crawling, then they don't learn to like hold their head up and look straight forward. And so where that comes into play later in life is reading. Because when you're reading and you're going from here up to here in a classroom, you're seeing what's on the board, and then you're looking down and you're reading what's on your worksheet or in your book, and you're constantly switching back and forth. That develops in crawling. And so if you don't crawl, if you're not getting that input, then all of a sudden kids struggle in reading, and everybody's like, well, why is there so much like struggle nowadays for reading? Like, why are kids struggling so much? Well, it's because we haven't really known that these developmental milestones are so important. And kids are missing some of the input that they need to really develop these parts of their brain. So everything that's on here is extremely important. And another one that was really interesting was during COVID. Like we saw a huge uptick in the need for speech after COVID, because so many people like kept their faces covered, even at home. And we wore masks. And then these kids, they didn't get to see lips move. They didn't get to see where the sound was coming from their parents or the people around them, because it was muffled, and it was also like through a mask. So they didn't get to see that.
That is interesting to think that your kids are modeling your speech behaviors.
Yeah. And if they can't see it, how do they model it?
Yeah.
Getting that input or getting that modeling to be able to produce the sounds and move your mouth in a certain way to produce language. Like if they weren't getting that during COVID, then we have to help with that. We have to give them the stimulation like they would have had back then. We see a lot of that. There's also a lot of social skills too that happened during that time. So we also saw an uptick in the need for social skills because kids weren't socialized. I mean, they interacted with people at home, but you get really used to interacting with 4 or 5, 6 people at home.
Yeah.
But you never see other kids because you never go to the park because it was, a scary place. So then the kids, they don't know what their peers are doing. They don't know like social norms or social appropriateness because that's usually modeled through their interaction with others.
Yeah.
And a lot of kids weren't even going to school.
Right.
And so even older kids, like they didn't get enough of that feedback and that information that they need. And so a lot of issues with social skills from that.
Wow.
There's some of these things in the developmental milestones that we look at that it might be lack of exposure. It might be that there's something getting in the way. Like we often talk about primitive reflexes and how when we move and we do things in our daily life, it reshapes our brain. And these reflexes that were there as babies, that's how they integrate. That's how they work themselves out. So if they've got issues with primitive reflexes like interrupting into their daily movements, then they have to figure out how to get that input that helps resolve those issues. And so we do a lot with primitive reflex, what we call integration from that. And what we're looking at is, can they meet these milestones? Or is there something like primitive reflexes getting in the way? There could be a whole myriad of other things. Like there's lots of like disabilities and diagnoses that interrupt that too. But sometimes you just need a little bit more exposure, or you need like a keen eye or trained people that can say like, when you're doing this at home, do it this way. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I also wanted to talk about how like this chart right here goes all the way up to 60 to 72 months. So that's like 5 to 6 years old, right? And then there's other charts that go all the way up to like 15. Yeah. And we know that like even most teenagers don't have a fully developed brain.
Right.
Like that usually doesn't happen till around 21.
Right.
And so if kids are still developing their brains and their bodies, even through their teenage years and things like that, can they still struggle with meeting their developmental milestones? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
And so it's very important to what we do. And actually on our building here, I was just remembering, like it says, reaching milestones on the building. Yeah. And it's because of that, because we're very developmental. And the way that we address this is by getting it into the home, getting the kids to find something simple to do that they can work on at home, because most of their time is spent at home. Or there's things that they can do just in their daily life that really make the difference in some of these kinds of things, the developmental milestones.
I was thinking too, with your last point of, there are sometimes things like, disabilities or other learning disorders that come into play. When I was growing up, and even when I was in college, a lot of people would tell me that they didn't know if autism was real, or like if it was just like some kind of made up disease. But like I've learned, since that, autism is a spectrum, and that a lot of things fall under that. And these are actual like learning disabilities and challenges that these kids face. People think like, oh, my kid doesn't have this issue or this issue because that didn't exist when I was younger. The reality is it did exist. It just we weren't just as informed.
Yeah, maybe we just didn't have a name to it either.
Right.
And we didn't have the research to back up what it actually is, right? I remember that too, like them saying back in the day that, autism was just part of something else, or, they had terms for it, but they didn't really know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And now we know, because of like brain scans, that their brains are actually wired differently than everybody else's. And so that also creates gaps in their milestones. Like that's why sometimes like they really struggle socially, or they really struggle with fine motor. And that's because of how their brains are wired. And it's a spectrum because every brain is different.
Right. And I've talked to like some of my friends who have kids, and they'll tell me things like, I'm just really worried, like he's showing early signs of autism or things like that. And honestly, like there's really nothing to be worried about because your kid isn't broken. Like there's nothing like inherently bad about your child. It's just they have certain issues going on in their life that's preventing them from meeting their goals. And and that's why there are places like Ability Innovations that exist to help those kids meet their goals and stay on track with their growth and development.
Yeah, exactly. I believe that every diagnosis, every disability, especially things like autism and ADHD and things like that, like it can really be a superpower. And that's why we have a superhero theme at Ability Innovations, because there's things that these kids are able to do that just regular run of the mill people like us don't. We can't even do it. We can't even fathom how to do that. But it just is so close to who they are that they can just do amazing things. And that's why we have like so many people that are on the spectrum or things like that that are neurodiverse
Mhm.
that have changed our world.
Yeah, like a lot
Because
of like the biggest like millionaires and billionaires
exactly.
are very open about being on the spectrum and stuff. So
And their brains are different.
Mhm.
And we live in a world where like technology, for example, is progressing so rapidly that we don't even know what it's going to look like in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Like we just started with AI.
Mhm.
But in 10 years, where is AI going to be? I'm talking about artificial intelligence,
Yeah, not Ability
not Ability
Innovations.
Innovations.
We make that mistake a lot.
But yeah, I mean, we don't know if we can actually prepare the kids for tomorrow because we don't know what tomorrow's going to look like.
Right.
Things are progressing so rapidly that we know that we need kids that think differently, that can address problems as they arise. And so we're starting to gear things like education and skill sets towards these abilities to adapt.
Mhm.
And the amazing thing is a lot of these kids that have disabilities like autism, or I would say even like Down syndrome or ADHD or anything like that, like they have the ability to adapt because they've had to. Like that's just part of who they are.
Yeah.
And so they're actually more able to adapt than most of us are because we just do our thing day in and day out. And they're constantly having to adapt and do things differently. So I don't feel like we should ever make them feel inferior.
Yeah.
But I do feel like there's a lot of things that can really like enhance what they're able to do.
Right.
And that's why we focus on things like milestones. Because there's a lot of things that if they can do this, they can access more in the world.
Yeah.
Right. Especially like social skills. Like we're going to need that. And it's not always important. Like you can have zero social skills and still be successful in the world. I could name off a few people that are like that.
Yeah.
We probably know some people like that. But at the same time, they usually gravitate towards certain professions that they don't need as much of the social skill part. They're very
Right.
technical and they can do those kinds of things. And they produce amazing things in the world.
Yeah, I've since I've worked here, I've always thought like Ability Innovations isn't about like fixing who you are, it's about embracing who you are as a person and as a child. And I love how you've created this whole superhero theme here, like these are these children's superpowers and like these kids are not broken. These kids are good kids. They just, like everyone on in this world, they just have issues and problems that they need help with.
And don't
And
we
that's why
all?
we're here, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so like there's places for them, like Ability Innovations. And there's ways that we can enhance what they're able to do and sometimes even find new abilities that they didn't know they had.
Yeah.
And that's the difference too between just normal therapy where we say like they need rehabilitation. And that means that they need to learn something over again.
Mhm.
Like they used to be able to do it. But we focus really heavily on habilitation,
Yeah.
which means they're learning it for the first time. It's hard to get insurance companies to understand
To see it
that part
way. Yeah.
because most of therapy is so focused on rehab.
Yeah.
And even like occupational therapists and physical therapists, like whenever you say that, people think, oh, that's rehab. They're
Right.
rehab professionals.
Right. Like, oh, my child broke his leg and needs to learn to walk again.
Right.
Like
And
that's
so-
what comes to mind, but it's so much deeper than that.
But what about the kids that are learning to walk?
Yeah, for the first time.
Yeah, that's habilitation. And that's where these milestones really come into play. Like they need to learn to do some of these things. Maybe not all of them, but they need to learn to do as many of them so that they can access the world around them.
Yeah.
And so I was going to talk a little bit before we end about some of the things that you can do at home as parents to really look at and enhance these kinds of things. Well, the one thing that we always talk about is play with them. That is how kids learn. And we often get parents that say like, no, my kid just needs to work on this. They need to sit at a table and just buckle down and work. And that's not how kids learn. That's not how the young in all of the world, like you don't see tigers just sitting around practicing one skill over and over and over until they've got it. They do that through play. And our kids are the same way. Like we get kids engaged in activities that they are interested in, and their brains work so much better when it's engaged in play. And that's, research based as well. Like it might take, I think one of the therapists was saying this quote, and I'm probably going to misquote it, but they were saying like, it takes like 127 times to learn one skill. Unless it's through play, then it takes 4.
Wow.
Or 8 or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
I think I remember hearing that in one of our meetings. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. And that's just how our brains work. That's how everybody's brain works.
Well, it makes sense too, because if you enjoy what you're doing, you're gonna, get familiar with it more.
Yeah. And so I think that's the key to a lot of this. A lot of the reaching milestones kinds of things are, can we do this in a way that the kid loves it, that they love doing what they're doing, and they're going to learn it because they're engaged in something that is meaningful and purposeful to them. And the other thing that I would say with parents is get familiar with this chart. Like go on our website, find milestone charts on the internet. Like you can search that on like Pinterest and things like that. And you can find these things and look up where your kid is at. And then you get this list of like bullet points of my kid should be able to do this. My kid should be able to do this. It's like, for example, if we're saying we've got like a 2-year-old, no, let's do a 4-year-old. So we say like in this section, which is cognitive, that they should be able to retell a story from a picture book. If you just sit down with them and you just read through a picture book, then maybe they can do it, maybe they can't. But what if you read through a picture book with them and then you dressed up as the characters and you retold the story through like doing a play or role play? Like that would be so much more engaging and the kids would love it, especially if it's a story that they know. Kind of like if you're reenacting Frozen with your kid, it's going to go a lot further than just reading a book.
Yeah.
And then other things on here like, can they dress themselves completely? Maybe not like tying shoelaces and things like that, but can they put on a shirt? Can they put on their socks and shoes? Can they do, easy buttons on their clothes, like their shirts or their pants or things like that? They should be working on those kinds of things. And we think, well, yeah, they get that opportunity like at least twice a day, dressing and undressing. But it's so much more engaging when they're doing that with a doll or a stuffed animal. Or I even had kids that they tried to put Barbie clothes on a dinosaur. And I thought that was great. And it's silly and fun, but they were actually working on these skills of using their hands to do a dressing activity. And it may not be on them, but it's engaging in a way. And so on top of just the normal, I get dressed 2 or 3 times. Well, 4-year-olds sometimes get dressed 9, 10, 12 times a day because they change their clothes once they learn how to do this.
If you're my niece, it's like a different princess outfit every 10 minutes.
And those things are fun. So they get that, but then also they can be working on the same skills involved by putting clothes on a dinosaur. Or we have a kiddo here that she has a service dog, or she had a service dog, and she would put costumes on the service dog. And dress the dog up. And I thought that was great because it was super fun for him. Yeah. So any way that you can make this more engaging and silly or something that they're doing with you, it's going to go a lot further. And I think another tip that I would share with parents is that it needs to go across different settings. And that's what we call like generalization. So, like if they are doing these kinds of activities, maybe not dressing, but if they were working on like drawing and coloring and scribbling and things like that, if they do that at school, and they do that at home, and they do that at grandma's house, and they do that in the car, and they do that at therapy, it goes so much further than just saying, this is our drawing time and we only do this like at school. Like we'll let the school worry about that.
Right.
That's good. Better is that it's in several places.
Right.
And best is that, we give them those opportunities all the time. Like I tell parents, there's like little doodle boards or magna doodles or boogie boards that you can just slip in your purse and you can take it everywhere with you.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime that your kid is bored, hand them the doodle pad and they're coloring and drawing and scribbling and doing all those things. But it's something that is engaging to them, but in a fun way. But also they get repeated exposure over and over and over.
Right.
And that's also how our brains work. Those are the kind of tips that I would say is make sure that it's fun and engaging and playful. Make sure that you're doing it over lots of different times and settings throughout the day. And then also making sure that it's in lots of different forms. So you don't just have to work on the thing that's on here. You can also work on the skills involved in those activities. So like if it's dressing, like we talked about, like they could be dressing a dog or a dinosaur, not necessarily on their person, but they're still working on the same skills, even though it's not on their person.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that makes sense. Well, thanks for throwing that all together last minute for us.
Kind of came together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Nick does do this for a living, so it's kind of up in his brain, and he's one of the best, so we appreciate it. But we'll go ahead and wrap up then. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Therapy Unmasked. As always, feel free to reach out to us through our website at abilityinnovations.com. I'll put in the show notes a link to these developmental milestones that Nick was talking about. We've gone through and ages 0 to 6, you can find all of the milestones that we focus on here at this clinic. And you can, make it fun with your kids. See where your kid is at, and then kind of test them, but do it in a fun way and just see if they're hitting these milestones. And if you feel like you need support, like always, feel free to schedule a free consultation with us. We're definitely here as a resource to help you with that. We also have tons of blogs and articles and other podcast episodes. So we just don't want you to feel alone, because we know that parenting can be difficult sometimes. It can be stressful, but we're here to help, and we're here to help your kid develop their superpowers and become the best version of them that they can be.
Yeah, and I think too, if you're at home and you just have questions, but you don't live anywhere close to an Ability Innovations location, and just give us a comment in the comment section, or help us reach out to you somehow, and we'll help you with some of these milestones, like in figuring out some things that you could do at home.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that'll be everything. So we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.